Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Last Passenger on Platform 6, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Hello dear listeners and welcome back to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, your host, and tonight I bring you a tale that begins not with a scream in the night or a body in the library, but with something far more ordinary yet infinitely more disturbing. A woman waiting for a train that would never come. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Waited. It was a dreary October evening in 1924 when the famous Belgian detective Hercule Poirot found himself at Victoria Station, not by choice but by circumstance. His own train to Brighton had been cancelled due to mechanical difficulties, leaving him stranded among the usual collection of weary travellers and restless commuters. The station echoed with the announcements of delays, the hiss of steam, and the perpetual shuffle of feet across worn stone floors. Poirot, ever meticulous in his habits, had seated himself on a bench near platform 6, consulting his pocket watch with the frequency of a man for whom punctuality was not merely a virtue but a sacred duty. It was then that his attention was drawn to a solitary figure seated 3 benches away, a woman in her 30s, dressed in a navy travelling coat that had seen better days, clutching a small leather handbag in her gloved hands. What struck Poirot initially was not her appearance, which was unremarkable enough, but her absolute stillness. While other passengers fidgeted, paced, or engaged in animated conversations about the inconvenience of delayed trains, this woman sat as motionless as a statue, her gaze fixed on the empty tracks beyond platform 6. She had been there when Poirot arrived at 7:30, and she remained there still as the clock hands crept toward 9. The train she appeared to be waiting for, the 8:15 to Folkestone, had been announced as delayed indefinitely due to signal problems along the line. Yet she made no move to inquire about alternative arrangements, showed no signs of frustration or impatience, and seemed entirely disconnected from the chaos around her. Poirot's analytical mind, unable to rest even during moments of personal inconvenience, began to catalogue the details. The woman's clothing suggested modest means but careful maintenance. Her coat was mended at one elbow with thread that nearly but not quite matched the original fabric. Her shoes, though well polished, showed the telltale creases of frequent wear. Most intriguingly, beside her on the bench sat a small suitcase bearing 2 distinct luggage tags, though from his distance, Poirot could not make out the names written upon them. As the evening wore on and the station gradually emptied of all but the most determined travellers, the woman remained. Poirot found himself increasingly fascinated by this display of unwavering patience. When a porter approached her shortly after 9 to inform her that the Folkestone service had been cancelled entirely and would not run until the following morning, she merely nodded and thanked him in a voice so soft it barely carried across the platform. It was at this point that Poirot made a decision that would later prove prophetic. Rising from his bench with the intention of offering assistance, for what gentleman could ignore a lady in apparent distress, he began to walk toward her. But before he could cover half the distance, a commotion at the station's main entrance drew his attention. A man in an expensive overcoat was arguing loudly with a ticket clerk about some perceived slight regarding seat reservations. The altercation lasted no more than 3 minutes, but when Poirot turned his attention back to platform 6, he was surprised to see that the woman had vanished. Her suitcase remained on the bench, abandoned as if she had simply evaporated into the thick London fog that had begun to seep through the station's glass roof. Concerned now, Poirot approached the bench and discovered something that would transform his idle curiosity into active investigation. The woman had not disappeared at all. She was still there, but she was no longer waiting for any train. She sat slumped against the back of the bench, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes staring sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling above. Lady Margaret Thornfield, for that was the name on one of her luggage tags, was quite dead. The discovery sent the station into immediate uproar. Police constables appeared with remarkable speed, cordoning off platform 6 and beginning the delicate process of investigating a death in one of London's busiest transportation hubs. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard arrived within the hour, his familiar figure cutting through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Well, well, Monsieur Poirot, Japp said upon spotting the Belgian detective among the witnesses. Trust you to be on hand when something interesting happens. I suppose you've already solved the whole business in that clever head of yours. Poirot shook his head slowly, his green eyes reflecting an unusual uncertainty. Non, mon ami. This case, it presents puzzles within puzzles. The lady, she has been waiting here for hours, yet she appears to have died within minutes. There are no obvious signs of violence, no indication of struggle, and yet, he gestured toward the suitcase which now lay open under police examination. Yet what? The luggage tags, they bear two different names. Lady Margaret Thornfield and Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. The ticket in her handbag is blank, never purchased, never validated. And most curious of all, Inspector, is this. Poirot withdrew a slip of paper from his waistcoat pocket. I took the liberty of examining the station's departure board before your arrival. There is no 8:15 service to Folkestone. There never was. Japp's eyebrows rose sharply. You mean she was waiting for a train that didn't exist? Precisement. The question we must ask ourselves is this: was Lady Margaret Thornfield or Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell a woman so desperate to escape her life that she would wait for a phantom train, or was she deliberately brought here by someone who knew she would never leave? As the evening fog grew thicker around Platform 6, and the last of the legitimate passengers departed for their homes, Poirot stood contemplating the bench where a woman had waited for hours only to meet death instead of departure. In his methodical mind, the questions were already forming into the precise patterns that would eventually lead to truth, but for now, there was only mystery, and the unsettling certainty that this was no accidental death. The game, as his English friend would say, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Names She Carried. The following morning found Poirot in the austere surroundings of Scotland Yard, where Inspector Japp had arranged for him to examine the personal effects of the deceased woman. The items lay spread across a wooden table like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. What we've got here, Japp began, consulting his notebook, is a proper mystery. The deceased had identification for two different people, Lady Margaret Thornfield and Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. The Thornfield documents appear genuine, showing an address in Belgravia and membership in several charitable societies. But the Hartwell papers, he shook his head. Those lead to a boarding house in Whitechapel that burned down 6 months ago. Poirot examined the documents with his magnifying glass, noting the quality of paper, the ink, the subtle differences in handwriting. The Thornfield identity, it is real but old. See here, the membership card for the Lady Auxiliary. It expires next month but shows no recent renewals. The Hartwell documents, they are more recent but... He paused, holding a piece of paper to the light. They are forgeries but very good ones. So she was trying to become someone else, or perhaps, Poirot mused, she was trying to stop being someone she already was. He turned his attention to the woman's handbag, a worn leather affair that contained the usual feminine necessities plus several items that were far from ordinary. Inspector, have you catalogued everything, down to the last hairpin? Though speaking of which, there's something odd. Her hair was held up with 2 pins, but we found 3 in the bag. The third one's different, newer, more expensive. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Show me. Japp produced 3 hairpins in a small evidence envelope. 2 were ordinary tortoiseshell, the kind available at any shop for a few pence. The third was elegant silver, decorated with small pearls that caught the light. This one, Poirot said, indicating the silver pin, it does not belong with the others. It is worth perhaps 10 times the value of her entire outfit. Where did such a pin come from? That's what we'd like to know. But there's more. Japp led Poirot to another table where the contents of the woman's suitcase had been arranged. Look at this. The suitcase contained clothing for perhaps a week's travel, but the garments told 2 different stories. Half were the well-made but dated clothes of a lady of reduced circumstances, the type Lady Margaret Thornfield might own. The other half were simpler, newer garments suitable for a working woman like Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell. She was preparing for a complete transformation, Poirot observed, but which direction? Was Lady Margaret becoming Mrs. Hartwell, or was Mrs. Hartwell aspiring to become Lady Margaret? There's something else that's bothering me, Japp said. We checked with the station staff. Several people remember seeing her arrive around 5 o'clock, but no one saw her leave the waiting area to go to platform 6. It's as if she materialized on that bench. Poirot frowned. That is impossible. She must have walked there unless... He paused, his eyes taking on that distant look that Japp had learned to recognize. Inspector, the layout of Victoria Station, show me a map. Japp produced a detailed diagram of the station. Poirot studied it intently, tracing various routes with his finger. Voila, there is another way to reach platform 6 without passing through the main waiting area. The service corridors used by the railway staff. If she knew of this route, or if someone else did and brought her that way. Precisely. Now, mon ami, tell me what the medical examiner has discovered. Japp's expression grew grim. That's where things get really strange. Dr. Bradley found no obvious cause of death. No wounds, no signs of poisoning that he could detect without further testing. But he did find something peculiar, a small puncture wound behind her left ear, so tiny it was almost missed. A puncture wound. Could have been made by a hatpin or similar implement. But here's the thing, it wouldn't have been fatal. Barely broke the skin. Dr. Bradley thinks she may have suffered some kind of shock or sudden fright that stopped her heart. Poirot was silent for a long moment, processing this information. A woman with two identities waiting for a train that does not exist, killed by a pinprick that should not have been lethal. Inspector, this case grows more curious by the moment. There's one more thing, Japp said, producing a railway timetable from among the evidence. This was in her coat pocket, but it's not a current timetable. It's from 1922, 2 years old, and someone has made markings on it. Poirot examined the timetable carefully. Several train times had been circled in pencil, and there were notations in the margins written in two different hands. One set of markings was in the same handwriting as found in both sets of identification papers. The other, this second hand, it is masculine and educated. See how the letters are formed. This person received classical instruction. But why would our victim carry a 2-year-old timetable with notations by someone else? Maybe it wasn't hers originally, or perhaps, Poirot said slowly, it was a message, a way of communicating meeting times and places that would appear innocent to any casual observer. If one were planning to disappear, such a method would be both clever and safe. Japp leaned back in his chair. So you think she was planning to vanish from her old life? I think, mon ami, that she had already begun to vanish. The question is whether she was running towards something, or away from it, and whether someone decided to ensure she never reached her destination. As they prepared to leave Scotland Yard, Poirot made a mental note of all the contradictions that surrounded this case. A woman with two names, a train that didn't exist, a valuable hairpin among cheap possessions, and a death by pinprick. Each element seemed to contradict the others, yet he knew that somewhere in these contradictions lay the truth. Inspector, he said as they stepped into the grey London morning, I think it is time we paid a visit to Belgravia. Lady Margaret Thornfield may be dead, but I suspect her former life still has stories to tell. Chapter 3. The House on Eaton Square. The address listed on Lady Margaret Thornfield's identification led Poirot and Inspector Japp to a narrow Georgian townhouse on Eaton Square, its once proud facade now bearing the subtle signs of genteel decay. The brass nameplate beside the door read, Mrs. Pemberton's Private Hotel for Ladies, and the small placard below advertised respectable accommodation for ladies of reduced circumstances. A thin woman in her 50s answered their knock, her shrewd eyes immediately assessing the nature of their visit. Mrs. Pemberton, she introduced herself. If you're from the police, you'll be wanting to know about Lady Margaret. Terrible business. She was one of our most reliable residents. How long had she been staying here? Japp inquired as they were shown into a dimly lit parlour that smelled of lavender and old grief. Nearly 3 years, Mrs. Pemberton replied, settling into a worn armchair. Came to us after her husband died. Lost everything in some sort of investment scandal, she did. Poor thing, had barely enough for her board and lodging. Poirot leaned forward with interest. She spoke of her circumstances. Oh, not directly. Lady Margaret was far too proud for that. But you could tell. Her jewellery went piece by piece, first the valuable items, then the sentimental ones. By the end, she had nothing left but her wedding ring, and a pair of pearl earrings she said belonged to her mother. Yet she continued to pay her rent. Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew uncomfortable. Well, that's the odd thing. These past 2 months she'd been struggling, behind on payments, you understand. But then, just last week, she settled everything, paid up through the end of the year. Where did this money come from? Jap asked. She said she'd come into a small inheritance from a distant relative. But, Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. Please, madame, Poirot encouraged gently. Any detail, however small, might be important. Well, it's just that she seemed different after that. Nervous, you might say. Kept checking the locks on her door, asked me twice if anyone had been asking for her. And she'd started going out at odd hours. Odd how? Late at night, sometimes not returning until dawn. Very unlike her usual habits. Lady Margaret was always most particular about propriety. Poirot requested to see the deceased woman's room, and Mrs. Pemberton led them up 2 flights of narrow stairs to a small chamber under the eaves. The room was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, with evidence of careful economizing in every corner. Patched curtains, darned stockings, and books whose pages had been read so often they fell open to favorite passages. She took most of her belongings with her yesterday, Mrs. Pemberton explained. Said she was going away for a few days to visit relatives, but she left these behind. On the small dressing table sat several items that immediately caught Poirot's attention. A photograph in a silver frame showing a distinguished gentleman in military uniform, a leather-bound diary with entries dating back several years, and a small wooden box containing what appeared to be ticket stubs and newspaper clippings. Poirot examined the photograph first. Her late husband, Sir Reginald Thornfield, yes, lost him in a motor car accident 2 years ago. Tragic, really. He was involved in some sort of financial venture that went wrong just before his death, left her with nothing but debts. The diary proved more illuminating. Lady Margaret's entries revealed a woman struggling not just with poverty but with shame and isolation. The elegant handwriting gradually became more hurried, more desperate, as the months progressed. Listen to this, Poirot said, reading from an entry dated 3 weeks prior. I cannot continue this charade much longer. Every day brings new humiliations, new reminders of what I've lost. Perhaps it would be better to simply disappear, to become someone else entirely. At least Mrs. Hartwell would have the dignity of honest poverty. So she was planning to change her identity, Jap observed. It appears so, but look at this entry from 1 week ago. Poirot flipped to a more recent page. He found me. After all this time he found me. Says he has a proposition, a way to solve all my problems. Part of me wants to trust him, but after Reginald's experiences, I fear anyone who promises easy solutions. Still, what choice do I have? Mrs. Pemberton peered over Poirot's shoulder. I don't know who she could mean. Lady Margaret never mentioned any gentlemen callers. Poirot turned his attention to the wooden box. Among the ticket stubs and clippings, he found several items that didn't belong. A business card for a private investigator named William Morse, a pawn shop receipt for a pair of pearl earrings, and most intriguingly, a newspaper advertisement that had been carefully cut out and circled in red ink. Private consultation, discreet assistance for ladies in difficult circumstances, complete confidentiality assured. Poirot read aloud, and there is a telephone number but no address. She never mentioned anything about seeing a private investigator, Mrs. Pemberton said, clearly disturbed by these revelations about her tenant. Jap made a note of the investigator's name and the telephone number. We'll need to track down this Morse fellow and whoever placed that advertisement. As they prepared to leave, Poirot noticed something else, a gap in the diary entries. The pages for the last 3 days had been carefully removed, cut out with a sharp blade. Mrs. Pemberton, he said, when Lady Margaret paid her rent last week, did you notice anything unusual about the money? Now that you mention it, yes, it was all in new notes, crisp as if they'd come straight from the bank, not the kind of money you'd expect from someone in her circumstances. And did she say anything else about this inheritance? Mrs. Pemberton frowned, trying to remember. She did mention something odd, said she'd finally found a way to make Reginald's death mean something. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. As they descended the stairs and took their leave, Poirot's mind was working furiously. Lady Margaret Thornfield had been a desperate woman who'd found an unexpected source of money just before her death. She'd been planning to disappear, to become someone else entirely, and someone, a mysterious he, had found her just when she thought she'd found a solution to her problems. "Inspector," Poirot said as they walked back toward the main road, "I believe we are dealing not with a simple case of murder, but with something far more complex. Lady Margaret was not killed to prevent her from leaving her old life behind. She was killed because someone needed her to stay exactly who she was." "What do you mean?" "Consider, mon ami. If she had successfully disappeared and become Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, what would have happened to Lady Margaret Thornfield? Officially, she would have simply vanished. But what if someone needed Lady Margaret Thornfield to die publicly, officially, with witnesses and police reports?" Japp stopped walking. "You think someone killed her specifically to create an official record of her death?" "I think," Poirot said quietly, "that we need to discover what happened to Sir Reginald's financial venture, and why someone might benefit from ensuring that both Thornfields are officially dead." Chapter 4: The Investigator's Secret. The business card found among Lady Margaret's possessions led Poirot and Inspector Japp to a narrow building in Bloomsbury, where William Morse maintained his private investigation practice. The brass plate beside the door was discreetly small, and the office itself reflected the careful modesty of a man who dealt in secrets. Morse himself was a surprise, younger than expected, perhaps 40, with the bearing of an ex-military man and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He received them with professional courtesy, but evident unease. "I was expecting someone would come asking about Lady Margaret," he said, gesturing for them to sit in the chairs arranged before his desk. "Terrible business. I read about it in the morning papers." "You had been working for her?" Japp asked directly. Morse hesitated, clearly weighing his obligations to client confidentiality against the implications of a murder investigation. "I had been consulting with her, yes, but the nature of that consultation is somewhat complicated." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "In what way complicated, monsieur?" "Lady Margaret came to me 6 weeks ago with what seemed like a straightforward request. She wanted to disappear, completely and permanently. She was prepared to pay handsomely for assistance in creating a new identity and establishing herself elsewhere. You specialize in such services, among other things." "I've helped several women escape unfortunate marriages or family situations. It's perfectly legal, if done properly." Morse opened a filing cabinet and withdrew a thin folder. "But Lady Margaret's case was different." "How so?" "For one thing, she wasn't running from anyone in particular. Most of my clients are fleeing specific threats: violent husbands, creditors, blackmailers. Lady Margaret simply wanted to cease being herself, said she was tired of being a reminder of her husband's failures." Japp made notes as Morse continued. "What did you discover about her circumstances?" "That's where things became interesting. I always conduct background investigations on my clients for their protection as much as mine. What I found regarding Sir Reginald Thornfield's death raised some troubling questions." Morse produced another file, this one considerably thicker. "Sir Reginald was involved in a mining venture in South Africa. On paper, it looked legitimate: surveys, permits, financial backing from several prominent investors. But shortly before his death, irregularities began to surface." "What kind of irregularities?" "The mine didn't exist. Oh, there was a location, and some preliminary excavation, but the geological surveys had been falsified. The ore samples were fraudulent. It was an elaborate confidence scheme, and Sir Reginald appears to have been both perpetrator and victim." Poirot's eyebrows rose. He was swindling his own investors. That's what the evidence suggested. But here's the peculiar part. When I dug deeper, I found indications that Sir Reginald himself may have been deceived. The geological reports he relied on came from a surveying company that turned out to be a front. The ore samples were provided by a mining consultant who disappeared shortly after Sir Reginald's death. Someone was using Sir Reginald to defraud his friends and associates. It appears so. And when the scheme began to unravel, Sir Reginald died in what was officially ruled an accidental motor car crash. Very convenient timing. Japp looked up from his notes. "You think Sir Reginald was murdered?"
I think Sir Reginald learned the truth about the mining venture and became a liability to whoever was really behind it. His death eliminated the one person who could expose the real criminals. Poirot studied the documents Morse had provided. And Lady Margaret, did she know of your suspicions? I had only just begun to share my findings with her. She was disturbed by the implications, said it explained some things that had never made sense about her husband's final weeks. What things? The secret meetings, the late-night telephone calls, the obvious fear that had been growing in him. She said he'd tried to tell her something the night before his death, but she'd been too tired to listen properly. Something about having found them out and needing to make it right. Morse closed the files and looked directly at both men. Gentlemen, I believe Lady Margaret contacted me not just to disappear, but because she'd begun to suspect her husband had been murdered. She wanted to vanish before whoever killed him realized she might know something. But she didn't vanish, Japp observed. She ended up dead on a train platform. Yes, and that troubles me greatly, because 3 days ago, Lady Margaret telephoned to say she'd changed her mind about disappearing, said she'd found another solution to her problems. Poirot's interest sharpened. Did she explain this solution? No, but she sounded different, excited, but also frightened. She said someone had contacted her, someone who could help her in a way that would honor her husband's memory. She gave no details, only that she was to meet this person yesterday evening. She asked me to hold on to all my research about the mining scheme, said she might need it as evidence. Evidence for what? Morse shook his head. She wouldn't say, but she did mention something strange, said that sometimes the only way to catch a killer is to let them think they've killed again. A chill ran through the room as the implications of this statement sank in. Poirot was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes distant with thought. Monsieur Morse, he said finally, this research of yours into the mining scheme, who else knew of it? Only myself and Lady Margaret, so far as I know. Why? Because if someone killed Sir Reginald to prevent exposure of the fraud, and now Lady Margaret is dead just as she claimed to have found a solution. Poirot paused. I fear we are dealing with someone who has been watching and waiting for 2 years, ready to eliminate anyone who might threaten their secret. Japp stood to leave. We'll need copies of all your files on both Thornfields. Of course, but gentlemen, Morse said as he walked them to the door, be careful. Whoever we're dealing with has killed twice to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. As they emerged onto the Bloomsbury Street, Poirot was unusually quiet. Finally Japp could contain his curiosity no longer. What are you thinking, Poirot? I am thinking, mon ami, that Lady Margaret Thornfield was far cleverer than anyone realized. She did not go to that train platform to disappear. She went there as bait, to draw out her husband's killer. But something went wrong with her plan. You think she was trying to catch the murderer herself? I think, Poirot said slowly, that she succeeded. The question is why she died in the attempt, and whether her death was part of her plan, or a deviation from it. Chapter 5. The Missing Train. The next phase of the investigation required Poirot and Inspector Japp to delve into the railway records at Victoria Station, where the station master, a precise man named Henderson, proved unexpectedly helpful in unraveling the mystery of the non-existent train. The 8:15 to Folkestone, Henderson repeated, consulting his comprehensive timetables. You're quite right, gentlemen. There's never been such a service. Our Folkestone trains depart at 7:45, 10:30 and 3:15. Been that schedule for the past 3 years. Yet Lady Margaret Thornfield was definitely waiting for this specific train. Poirot mused. She had mentioned it to several people, had checked on its departure time. Someone deliberately gave her false information. Henderson pulled out older timetables, spreading them across his desk. Now, that's interesting. There was an 8:15 to Folkestone, but it was discontinued in October 1922. Budget cuts and low ridership. The same period as the date on the old timetable, found in her possession, Japp observed. Precisely. But here is what is more curious, Poirot said, examining the old schedules. In 1922, the 8:15 train had a particular peculiarity. It stopped at 7 stations between London and Folkestone, including one at Ashford, that was discontinued when the service ended. Henderson nodded. Ashford was a special stop, mostly used by railway employees, and a few local residents. When we cancelled the service, we rerouted those passengers through the main line.
Monsieur Henderson, Poirot continued, I would like to examine the passenger manifests for that discontinued service, particularly the final month of operation. It took nearly an hour to locate the archived records, but when Henderson produced them, they revealed something extraordinary. In the final weeks of the 8:15 service, there had been several regular passengers who used the train specifically for the Ashford stop. Among them was a name that made both Poirot and Japp sit up with interest. R. Caldwell. Who is R. Caldwell? Japp asked. Henderson consulted his employee records. Richard Caldwell was a signals engineer with the South Eastern Railway, worked the Ashford Junction from 1920 until, he paused checking dates, until November 1922, resigned shortly after the service cancellation. Do you have his address? His last known address was in Ashford, but that was over 2 years ago. I can provide it, but he's likely moved on. Poirot studied the passenger manifests more carefully. Inspector, look at this. R. Caldwell purchased tickets not just for himself, but occasionally for companions. In September 1922, he bought tickets for someone identified only as R.T. Reginald Thornfield perhaps. The timing would be correct. Sir Reginald died in October 1922, just before the service was cancelled. Henderson looked confused. I don't understand the connection you're drawing, gentlemen. Neither do we entirely, Japp admitted. But it's becoming clear that this discontinued train service is somehow central to our case. Poirot requested to examine the platform from which the 8:15 had departed. Henderson led them through the station to platform 6, where Lady Margaret had been found dead. This is the platform, Henderson explained. When the 8:15 was running, it was one of our busier departure points. Now it's mainly used for freight and occasional special services. And last night, Poirot asked, was there any scheduled activity on platform 6? Henderson consulted his logbook. Actually, yes. We had a freight shipment scheduled to arrive at 9:30, but it was cancelled due to the signal problems that delayed so many services yesterday. So at the time Lady Margaret was found dead, platform 6 should have been busy with freight operations. That's correct. The cancellation left it completely empty. Poirot walked the length of the platform, examining the bench where the body had been found, the nearby signal box, and the various access points. Henderson, this freight shipment that was cancelled, who was it intended for? The station master checked his records again. It was a private shipment, consigned to Caldwell Holdings. The contact person was, he paused, double-checking the entry, R. Caldwell, the same name from the old passenger manifests. Japp and Poirot exchanged glances. Do you have contact information for this Caldwell Holdings? Just a telephone number for arranging deliveries, but now that I think about it, we've had several shipments for them over the past few months, always scheduled for late evening delivery, always to platform 6. What kind of shipments? Mining equipment, mostly. Surveying instruments, geological tools, nothing unusual for a mining company. Poirot felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into new configurations. A signals engineer named Caldwell, who had known Sir Reginald, a mining company that received shipments at the exact platform where Lady Margaret died, and a discontinued train service that connected them all. Henderson, he said, I need you to check something for me. Yesterday evening, before Lady Margaret was found, did anyone else inquire about the 8:15 to Folkestone? The station master thought carefully. Actually, yes. A gentleman came to the information desk around 6 o'clock, asked specifically about that service. When told it didn't exist, he seemed quite agitated, said he was supposed to meet someone on that train. Can you describe this gentleman? Middle-aged, well-dressed, carried himself like military or professional, had an umbrella despite the clear weather. I remember thinking it odd that he'd ask about a service that's been cancelled for 2 years. Did he give his name? No, but he did ask a strange question. Wanted to know if we had any services that used the old 8:15 schedule, even if they weren't passenger trains. Poirot's eyes brightened with understanding. And what did you tell him? That the freight service sometimes follows similar routing for efficiency. He seemed very interested in that information. As they left the station, Japp was full of questions. So this Caldwell fellow knew Sir Reginald, runs a mining company. and was expecting to meet someone on a train that didn't exist. You think he's our killer? I think, Poirot replied carefully, that Mr. Caldwell is certainly someone we need to meet, but I suspect the truth may be more complex than simple guilt or innocence. What do you mean? Consider this, mon ami. Lady Margaret was not just waiting for a train, she was waiting for someone she expected to arrive on that train, and that someone was expecting to meet her. When he discovered the train didn't exist, he became agitated, perhaps because he realized that someone had manipulated them both. You think they were both being set up? I think, Poirot said quietly, that someone used the old train schedule as a way to bring together two people who posed a threat to them, one who knew too much about a fraudulent mining scheme, and one who had been investigating it. But Lady Margaret still ended up dead. Yes, but perhaps not according to the original plan. Perhaps something went wrong, and now we must discover whether Mr. Caldwell is a second victim or the killer himself. Chapter 6. The Man Who Missed His Train. The telephone number for Caldwell Holdings led Poirot and Inspector Japp to a modest office building in Southwark, where they found Richard Caldwell hunched over a desk covered with geological surveys and mining equipment catalogues. He was a man in his 40s, with the weathered hands of someone who had spent years working with machinery, and the careful eyes of an engineer accustomed to spotting the smallest flaws in complex systems. When they introduced themselves, Caldwell's reaction was immediate and telling, not surprise, but relief, as if he had been expecting their visit and dreading it in equal measure. "You're here about Lady Margaret," he said without preamble, gesturing for them to sit in the cramped office space. "I've been expecting someone ever since I read about her death in the papers. Terrible business. She didn't deserve what happened to her." "You knew Lady Margaret Thornfield well?" Japp asked, settling into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. "Not well, no, but I knew her husband, Sir Reginald, quite well indeed. We worked together on what I thought was going to be the opportunity of a lifetime." Caldwell's expression grew bitter. "Instead it became the biggest mistake I ever made." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "You were involved in Sir Reginald's mining venture." "I was the technical consultant. My job was to verify the geological surveys, ensure the equipment specifications were correct, and oversee the initial excavation work. I had 20 years of experience with the railway's engineering department, and I thought that qualified me to evaluate a mining operation." Caldwell laughed harshly. "I was spectacularly wrong." "How so?" "The whole thing was a fraud from the beginning, but it was so cleverly constructed that even I was fooled. The geological surveys looked perfect, proper formatting, correct technical language, convincing data. The ore samples tested exactly as they should. It wasn't until we were 3 months into the project that I began to notice the inconsistencies." Caldwell pulled out a file drawer and extracted several thick folders. The survey data was real, but it was from a completely different location. Someone had taken legitimate geological reports from a productive mine in Australia and altered the coordinates to make it appear they applied to our site in South Africa. And the ore samples, genuine gold ore, but planted at the test sites. We were essentially mining a salted claim, one that had been deliberately seeded with valuable materials to deceive investors. Japp made careful notes as Caldwell continued his explanation. "When did you realize what was happening?" "September 1922. I was reviewing the excavation reports when I noticed that we should have been finding specific mineral formations based on the geological surveys, but they simply weren't there. I started doing my own independent testing, and discovered that the geology of our site was completely different from what we'd been told." "What did you do with this information?" "I went to Sir Reginald immediately. Poor fellow was devastated. He'd invested not just his own money, but had convinced several friends to put substantial sums into the venture. He felt responsible for their losses, even though he'd been deceived just as thoroughly as they had." Poirot studied the documents Caldwell had produced. "Did you identify who was behind the deception?" That's where things became dangerous. Sir Reginald had been working primarily with a man named Vincent Morrison, who claimed to represent a consortium of South African mining interests. Morrison had provided all the initial documentation, arranged the site lease, and handled the financial arrangements. And Mr. Morrison disappeared the moment we started asking difficult questions. The company he claimed to represent turned out to be a shell corporation. The office address in Johannesburg led to an empty building. It was as if Vincent Morrison had never existed. Caldwell opened another folder, revealing photographs and correspondence, but Sir Reginald was determined to track him down. He hired private investigators, contacted mining authorities in South Africa, even travelled there himself in August 1922. He was convinced that Morrison was part of a larger operation that was defrauding investors across multiple ventures. Did his investigations yield results? They yielded something much more dangerous than results. They yielded attention from people who didn't want to be found. In the weeks before his death, Sir Reginald became convinced he was being watched. He started varying his routes home, checking his motor car for tampering, and he asked me to hold on to copies of all our documentation as insurance. Japp looked up from his notes. You think he was murdered? I know he was murdered. The official investigation claimed brake failure, but I examined that motor car myself after the accident. The brake lines had been cut, skillfully, but unmistakably. Someone wanted Sir Reginald dead before he could expose their operation. And you, why weren't you targeted as well? Caldwell's expression grew grim. Who says I wasn't? 3 days after Sir Reginald's funeral, my house was burgled. Nothing of obvious value was taken, but all my files related to the mining venture disappeared. A week later, I received a visit from 2 men who suggested very politely that I might be happier pursuing other opportunities. You left your position with the railway. I had no choice. They made it clear that my continued investigation into the mining fraud would be detrimental to my health. So I started this consulting business, and tried to put the whole affair behind me. But you couldn't, could you? Poirot observed. No, the theft of those files told me that someone was still very much concerned about what Sir Reginald and I had discovered. And when Lady Margaret contacted me 3 weeks ago, I realized the threat hadn't ended with her husband's death. This revelation caught both investigators off guard. Lady Margaret contacted you. She'd found my name in her husband's papers, and tracked me down through the railway pension office. She said she'd been investigating her husband's death, and had come to believe it wasn't accidental. She wanted to know what we'd discovered about the mining fraud. What did you tell her? Everything. I gave her copies of all the documentation I'd managed to preserve, the falsified surveys, the correspondence with Morrison, the evidence of the salted ore samples. She was particularly interested in the financial arrangements, the list of investors who'd been defrauded. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. She wanted the investor list, said she recognized some of the names, and that one in particular had surprised her. Someone she'd never suspected of being involved in risky investments. Did she identify this person? Caldwell shook his head. No, but she asked me to meet her yesterday evening to discuss it further. Said she'd had contact from someone who might be able to help us finally expose the truth about her husband's death. The meeting was arranged for Platform 6. That's the strange part. She specifically requested that we meet as if we were catching the old 8:15 to Folkestone, the train I used to take when I was working the Ashford Junction. She said it would be symbolic, since that's where Sir Reginald and I first discussed the mining opportunity. Japp leaned forward. But you didn't make the meeting. I tried to, but when I got to the station and inquired about the 8:15, they told me it had been cancelled years ago. I thought Lady Margaret had made a mistake, so I waited around for a while, hoping she'd realize the error and find me. You never saw her. Not until, Caldwell's voice dropped, not until I heard the commotion on Platform 6 and realized something terrible had happened. Poirot sat back in his chair, processing this information. Mr. Caldwell, this person who Lady Margaret said might help expose the truth, did she give you any indication of who it might be? Only that it was someone who had been hiding in plain sight, and who finally wanted to set the record straight. She seemed excited, but also frightened. Said that sometimes the only way to catch a criminal is to become the bait yourself. The same phrase William Morse had mentioned. Lady Margaret had been planning something, and it had gotten her killed. Chapter 7. The Banker's Confession. The revelation that Lady Margaret had recognized someone unexpected among the defrauded investors sent Poirot's investigation in a new direction. Armed with the complete list of investors provided by Richard Caldwell, he and Inspector Japp began the meticulous process of examining each name, looking for connections that might have led to 2 murders. The list was impressive in its scope. 23 individuals and institutions had invested in Sir Reginald's mining venture, contributing amounts ranging from £500 to £5,000. Most were exactly what one would expect: wealthy merchants, retired military officers, and small investment syndicates, looking for high returns in colonial enterprises. But 3 names stood out as particularly significant. The first was Lord Ashworth, a prominent member of Parliament, who had served on several committees overseeing colonial development. His investment of £2,000 represented a substantial sum for a man on a government salary. The second was Dr. Harrison Vance, a respected physician, who had apparently invested not only his own money but funds belonging to several of his patients, elderly widows, who had entrusted their savings to his care. The third name, however, was the one that made Poirot's pulse quicken with recognition: Mr. Cornelius Shaw, identified in the documents as a director of the London and Scottish Bank. Shaw, Japp repeated, consulting his notebook. Wasn't that the name of one of the bank managers we spoke to about the Liberty Bond case? Indeed, Poirot replied thoughtfully. Mr. Shaw, who was conveniently taken ill just before the bonds were to be transported, and who had access to the special lock used on Mr. Ridgway's trunk. You think there's a connection? I think, mon ami, that we have been looking at separate cases when we should have been looking at a pattern. Consider, we have a mining fraud that cost investors thousands of pounds, a suspicious death of the man who discovered the fraud, and now the murder of his widow just as she was preparing to expose new evidence. And Shaw was involved in all of it. Shaw was an investor who lost money in the mining scheme. But what if he was more than just a victim? What if he was Vincent Morrison? The implications of this possibility sent them immediately to the London and Scottish Bank, where they requested an urgent meeting with both joint general managers. Mr. Vavasour received them in his office, but Mr. Shaw was, they were told, at home recovering from a recent relapse of his bronchial condition. I must ask you to be more specific about your concerns, Mr. Vavasour said when they explained their need to discuss Mr. Shaw's involvement in certain investments. Cornelius has been with this bank for over 20 years. His reputation is beyond reproach. Poirot chose his words carefully. We are investigating possible connections between several cases, including the recent death of Lady Margaret Thornfield. We have reason to believe that Mr. Shaw may have information relevant to our inquiry. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the woman found dead at Victoria Station. Mr. Vavasour looked genuinely puzzled. I'm afraid I don't understand what connection Cornelius could possibly have to such a tragic affair. Did you know that Mr. Shaw was an investor in a South African mining venture, promoted by Lady Margaret's late husband? The colour drained from Mr. Vavasour's face. That's impossible. Bank policy strictly forbids our officers from engaging in speculative investments, particularly in colonial mining ventures. Cornelius would never. I have documentary evidence that he invested £3,000 in the scheme. Japp interrupted, producing copies of the investor documents. That's a substantial sum for a bank manager. Mr. Vavasour examined the papers with growing alarm. If this is true, it represents a serious breach of bank policy. But I find it difficult to believe that Cornelius would risk his career for any investment opportunity, unless, Poirot suggested gently, he was not merely an investor, but was involved in organizing the scheme itself. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting that Mr. Shaw may have used his position at the bank to identify wealthy clients who might be suitable targets for investment fraud. His knowledge of their financial situations would make him invaluable to confidence men looking for victims. Mr. Vavasour was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications. Finally he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. There have been irregularities. What kind of irregularities? Over the past 2 years several of our clients have complained about unauthorized approaches regarding investment opportunities. Someone had clearly accessed their financial records and knew details about their wealth and circumstances that should have been confidential. And you suspected Mr. Shaw? I suspected someone within the bank,
but Cornelius has always been above suspicion. However, now that you mention it, the complaints began around the same time as his first bout of illness in 1922. Japp leaned forward. His illness, when exactly did it begin? Mr. Vavasour consulted his records. October 1922. He was absent for nearly a month, claiming severe bronchial problems. It was unusual for a man of his normally robust health. The same month Sir Reginald Thornfield had died. Poirot felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Mr. Vavasour, we need Mr. Shaw's home address, and I would strongly advise you to begin an immediate audit of all accounts he has had access to over the past 3 years. The address led them to a modest house in Hampstead, where Mrs. Shaw received them with the nervous courtesy of a woman unaccustomed to police visits. She was a thin, anxious creature, who seemed to live in perpetual fear of her husband's disapproval. Cornelius is in his study, she said, leading them through a house that smelled of carbolic and chronic illness. He's been feeling poorly again lately. The stress of work, you understand. The study was a cramped room lined with banking journals and financial publications. Mr. Shaw sat behind a small desk, and the change in his appearance since their last meeting was striking. He had lost weight, his complexion was pale and waxy, and his hands trembled slightly as he attempted to rise from his chair. Gentlemen, he said, his voice hoarse, I was wondering when you would come. Mr. Shaw, Poirot said gently, we need to discuss your investment in Sir Reginald Thornfield's mining venture. Shaw's composure crumbled instantly. He sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. I never meant for anyone to die, he whispered. It was supposed to be a simple confidence scheme, take money from people who could afford to lose it, disappear quietly, and start over somewhere else. But Sir Reginald discovered the truth. He was too clever for his own good, and too honest. When he realized what was happening, he wouldn't let it go. He was going to expose everything, ruin all of us. So you killed him. Shaw shook his head violently. Not me. I couldn't. I'm not a violent man. But there were others involved, people who had more to lose than just money. Who? Vincent Morrison wasn't a real person. It was an identity I created for the mining scheme. But the operation was bigger than just me. There were others who provided the falsified documents, the salted ore samples, the shell companies. When Sir Reginald threatened to expose us, Shaw's voice trailed off, but Poirot pressed him to continue. They decided he had to die. I argued against it, but they said it was the only way to protect the operation. And when Lady Margaret started investigating, you killed her too. I arranged to meet her, yes. But I was going to confess everything, help her expose the truth. I thought if I cooperated with her, she might show mercy. But when I got to the station, Shaw looked up with desperate eyes. Someone else was there, someone who had been watching both of us. Lady Margaret was already dead when I found her. Chapter 8. The Doctor's Deception. Shaw's confession opened a new chapter in the investigation, but it also raised more questions than it answered. If he hadn't killed Lady Margaret, then who had? And who were these mysterious others involved in the mining fraud, who were apparently willing to commit murder to protect their secret? The answer came from an unexpected source, Dr. Harrison Vance, the physician whose name appeared on the investor list, not just as a participant, but as someone who had invested other people's money without their knowledge. Poirot and Inspector Japp found Dr. Vance in his Harley Street practice, a prosperous-looking establishment that catered to London's wealthy elite. The doctor himself was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the authoritative manner of someone accustomed to having his professional opinions accepted without question. When they explained the purpose of their visit, Dr. Vance's reaction was immediate and revealing. Unlike Shaw's nervous collapse, the doctor became coldly defensive, as if he had been preparing for this confrontation for months. I'm afraid I don't understand what my private investments could possibly have to do with a police investigation, he said, settling behind his imposing desk with calculated composure. My financial affairs are entirely legitimate and properly documented, including the funds you invested on behalf of your patients, Japp asked directly. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Dr. Vance's features. I occasionally provide investment advice to patients who request it. There's nothing irregular about that. Even when you invest their money without their explicit consent, that's a serious accusation, Inspector. I hope you have substantial evidence to support it. Poirot leaned forward with interest. Dr. Vance, we have spoken with several of your elderly patients whose savings were invested in Sir Reginald Thornfield's mining venture. They were told their money was being placed in safe government bonds. If there was a misunderstanding about the nature of the investments, it was certainly not intentional. The mining venture appeared to be a secure opportunity with excellent returns, even after you learned it was fraudulent. Dr. Vance's composure finally cracked. I had no knowledge that the venture was fraudulent until after the losses had occurred. I was as much a victim as anyone else. Yet you continued to conceal the truth from your patients, allowing them to believe their money was safely invested elsewhere. I was protecting them from unnecessary distress. Many of my patients are elderly and in poor health. The shock of learning about their financial losses could have been fatal. Japp consulted his notebook. According to our records, you invested over £8,000 of patients' money in the mining scheme. That represents the life savings of at least a dozen people. I was trying to secure their financial futures. The returns would have been substantial if the venture had been legitimate. But you knew it wasn't legitimate, didn't you, Doctor? Poirot's voice was deceptively gentle. You knew because you were part of the scheme from the beginning. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Doctor. Vance stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the busy street below. You don't understand the pressures I was under, he said finally. My practice was struggling. Medical costs were rising, and many of my patients couldn't afford proper treatment. The mining venture seemed like a way to solve everyone's problems, so you created false medical documents to support the fraud. I provided medical certification for the mining surveys. Someone needed to verify that the working conditions were safe, that the site was free from tropical diseases. My signature carried weight with potential investors, but the site never existed. No, I was signing documents for a fictional mine based on falsified geological reports. But the money was real, and it was helping me provide better care for patients who desperately needed it. Poirot stood and began pacing the small office. Dr. Vance, when did you first meet Vincent Morrison? Vincent Morrison was Cornelius Shaw, as I'm sure you've discovered. He approached me in early 1922 with a proposition. He knew I had access to wealthy patients who might be interested in investment opportunities, and he offered me a substantial commission for any clients I could refer. And when Sir Reginald began investigating the fraud, Dr. Vance's expression grew pained. Shaw was terrified. He said Sir Reginald was going to expose everything, that we'd all face criminal charges. I tried to convince him that we should confess and make restitution, but Shaw said there was someone else involved, someone with much more to lose than either of us. This person had provided the initial funding for the scheme, and had connections that could destroy us all if we didn't handle the situation properly. Who was this person? I never knew. Shaw referred to him only as the Major. He said this person had military connections and political influence that made him extremely dangerous to cross.
Japp looked up from his notes. Did you ever meet this Major? Only once, and very briefly. It was in October 1922, just after Sir Reginald's death. Shaw arranged a meeting to discuss how we would handle the collapse of the mining venture. The Major was there, but he stayed in the shadows. I never saw his face clearly. What did he tell you? That Sir Reginald's death had solved our immediate problem, but that we needed to be prepared for future threats. He said Lady Margaret might eventually become suspicious, and that we should be ready to handle that situation if it arose. Poirot felt a chill at these words. He was planning Lady Margaret's death even then. He said he hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but that we all had too much to lose to allow sentiment to interfere with practical decisions. And you agreed to this, Doctor? Vance turned from the window, his face etched with guilt and exhaustion. I told myself that Lady Margaret would eventually move on, find a new life, forget about her husband's business affairs. I never imagined she would spend 2 years investigating his death. But she did investigate, and she discovered the truth. Last week I received a telephone call from Shaw. He was in a panic, said Lady Margaret had contacted him and was demanding a meeting. The Major had decided she posed too great a risk to ignore any longer. So you killed her? No. Dr. Vance's denial was immediate and vehement. I refused to have any part in violence. I told Shaw I would confess everything rather than see another person murdered. Then who killed her? The Major. Shaw told me later that the Major had handled the situation personally. said it had been made to look like a heart attack brought on by stress and excitement. Poirot's mind raced as he processed this information. Dr. Vance, this heart attack, how would one induce such a thing? There are several methods. A sudden shock to the nervous system, certain pharmaceutical compounds, or, he paused, realizing the implications of his words, or, a precisely placed injection of air into the bloodstream. It would cause an embolism that could stop the heart almost instantly. With a very fine needle, the injection site would be nearly impossible to detect. Like a puncture wound behind the ear, Dr. Vance paled. Yes, that would be an ideal location. The victim would lose consciousness immediately and die within seconds. And such a technique would require medical knowledge, or military training in silent elimination methods. Some special forces units are taught such techniques. Poirot exchanged glances with Jap. They were finally closing in on their killer, but the identity of the major remained frustratingly elusive. Dr. Vance, Poirot said, I need you to think very carefully. During your brief meeting with this major, did you notice anything that might help us identify him? His voice, his mannerisms, any distinguishing features? Dr. Vance closed his eyes, clearly struggling to recall details from a meeting he had tried to forget. He spoke with authority, like someone accustomed to giving orders. His posture was military, ramrod straight, precise movements. And there was something about his left hand. What about his left hand? He kept it in his pocket throughout the meeting, as if he was concealing an injury or deformity. I remember thinking it odd for someone so otherwise meticulous in his appearance. Chapter 9. The Major's Identity. The description of a military man with something wrong with his left hand gave Poirot and Inspector Jap their first concrete lead in identifying the mysterious major. Their investigation led them to the War Office, where a clerk named Peterson proved unexpectedly helpful in their search through military records. A major with a left-hand injury from the recent war, Peterson mused, consulting various filing systems. That narrows it down considerably. Most hand injuries serious enough to cause permanent concealment would have resulted in medical discharge or at least notation in service records. After 2 hours of methodical searching, Peterson produced a file that made both investigators sit up with interest. Major Edmund Ashworth, invalided out of service in 1919 due to severe shrapnel wounds to the left hand, lost 2 fingers and has limited mobility in the remaining digits. Ashworth, Jap repeated. That name was on the investor list, Lord Ashworth. The same family, according to these records, Peterson confirmed. Major Edmund Ashworth is the younger brother of Lord Ashworth. Distinguished military career until his injury, specialized in reconnaissance and what the files delicately term special operations behind enemy lines. Poirot studied the military photograph attached to the file. Major Ashworth was a lean, intense-looking man with penetrating eyes, and the kind of rigid bearing that suggested absolute self-discipline. Even in the formal portrait, there was something unsettling about his gaze. What happened to him after his discharge? Jap asked. Peterson flipped through several pages, initially drew a disability pension, but that ceased in 1921 when he apparently found private employment. The file doesn't specify what kind of work, but there's a notation that he declined several offers of government positions. Any current address? The last known address is from 1922, a flat in Bloomsbury, but given that the pension payments stopped, he's likely moved. Armed with this information, Poirot and Jap made their way to the Bloomsbury address, a narrow building that had been converted into modest flats for single gentlemen of limited means. The landlady, Mrs. Whitmore, remembered Major Ashworth well. Kept to himself, did the Major, she said, leading them up 2 flights of stairs to a small room under the eaves. Very particular about his privacy, always paid his rent in advance, never had visitors. Polite enough, but there was something about him that made you not want to ask too many questions. When did he leave? September 1922, quite suddenly. Came to me one morning, said he'd received an offer of employment that required immediate relocation, paid up what he owed and was gone by noon. Did he leave a forwarding address? No, and that was unusual. Most tenants want their post forwarded, but the Major said he wouldn't be needing that service. The room itself had been thoroughly cleaned and re-let, but Mrs. Whitmore had kept a few items that the Major had left behind. Nothing valuable, she explained, producing a small box, just some papers and oddments that he forgot in his haste to leave. Among the forgotten items was a railway timetable from 1922, the same period as the one found in Lady Margaret's possession, and a business card for a private investigator named William Morse. Morse, Poirot murmured, the same investigator Lady Margaret consulted. There was also a photograph, creased and faded, showing two men in military uniform standing beside what appeared to be a mining operation. One was clearly Major Ashworth, the other was labelled on the back as R.O.T. Johannesburg 1918. R.T., Japp said, Reginald Thornfield. It appears that Major Ashworth and Sir Reginald knew each other from military service in South Africa, Poirot observed. This photograph suggests they were both involved in mining operations during the war. Mrs. Whitmore studied the photograph with interest. That would explain something that always puzzled me about the Major. He received regular letters from South Africa, always with mining company return addresses. I remember thinking it odd for a man who claimed to have no business interests. Did you recognize any of the company names? One came up frequently, Transvaal Mining Consortium. The letters always seemed to agitate him. He'd pace his room for hours after receiving them. Poirot felt another piece of the puzzle sliding into place. Mrs. Whitmore, these letters from South Africa, when did they stop coming? Around the time he left, September 1922. Actually, now that I think about it, he received one final letter just days before he departed. That one seemed to upset him more than usual. I heard him talking to himself afterward, something about settling old scores and protecting what's mine. As they left the boarding house, Poirot's mind was working furiously to connect the various threads of the case. Major Ashworth had known Sir Reginald during their military service in South Africa, had been receiving letters from mining companies there, and had disappeared just when the fraudulent mining scheme began to collapse. It's all connected, he said to Japp as they walked through the grey London streets. The military service in South Africa, the mining knowledge, the ability to forge geological documents. Major Ashworth wasn't just a participant in the fraud, he was its architect. But why involve Shaw and Dr. Vance? Because he needed local contacts with access to potential investors. Shaw could identify wealthy bank clients, and Dr. Vance could provide medical credibility to the scheme. But when Sir Reginald's investigation threatened to expose everything, Ashworth killed him to protect the operation, and when Lady Margaret began her own investigation 2 years later, he killed her as well. But this time something went wrong with his plan. Japp consulted his notebook. According to Dr. Vance, Ashworth planned to make Lady Margaret's death look like a heart attack, but the medical examiner found a puncture wound. Precisely, I believe Major Ashworth intended for Lady Margaret to die quietly, apparently from natural causes brought on by the stress of her situation. But something forced him to act hastily, perhaps the unexpected presence of witnesses, or the arrival of railway staff. So what's our next move? Poirot paused at a street corner, his green eyes distant with thought. We need to find Major Ashworth's current location, and I suspect that will require us to discover what happened to the money from the mining fraud. Such a large sum doesn't simply disappear, it gets reinvested, laundered or hidden. You think he's still in London? I think, Poirot said slowly, that Major Ashworth has been hiding in plain sight, using a new identity just as Lady Margaret planned to do. But unlike her, he succeeded in his transformation. Into what? Into someone so respectable, so above suspicion, that he could commit murder in one of London's busiest railway stations and walk away undetected. Someone with the confidence and authority to approach a frightened woman and convince her to trust him, even as he killed her. The pieces of the puzzle were nearly complete, but the final picture they formed would prove more shocking than either investigator could have imagined. Chapter 10. The Final Truth. The breakthrough in identifying Major Ashworth's current location came from an unexpected source, the silver hairpin found among Lady Margaret's possessions. Poirot's careful examination of the piece revealed a jeweller's mark that led them to an exclusive shop in Bond Street, where the proprietor remembered the unusual custom order. Yes, I recall this piece quite distinctly, said Mr. Goldsmith, examining the hairpin through his looper. It was commissioned 6 months ago by a gentleman who was very specific about the design. He wanted something that would be beautiful but also functional, sturdy enough for practical use. Can you describe this gentleman? Japp asked. Distinguished military bearing, well-dressed, spoke with authority. He paid in cash and seemed quite knowledgeable about jewelry craftsmanship. What struck me most was his left hand. He kept it gloved throughout our meeting, even when handling the samples. Did he give a name? Major Morrison said the piece was a gift for his sister. Morrison, the same false identity used in the mining fraud. Poirot felt the familiar thrill of discovery as the final pieces of the puzzle arranged themselves in his mind. Did Major Morrison collect the piece himself? No, he sent someone else, a young woman who matched the description he'd provided. Pleasant girl seemed quite pleased with the hairpin. She mentioned that her brother was always thoughtful about gifts. The description of the woman matched Lady Margaret perfectly. The hairpin hadn't belonged to her originally. It had been sent to her by Major Ashworth as a lure, probably accompanying his invitation to the meeting that would prove fatal. Mr. Goldsmith, Poirot continued, did Major Morrison provide an address for correspondence? The jeweller consulted his records, temporary accommodation at the Savoy Hotel, but I believe he mentioned he was in the process of purchasing a permanent residence. The Savoy proved to be another dead end. Major Morrison had indeed stayed there briefly, but had left no forwarding address. However, the hotel register provided one crucial piece of information. He had listed his occupation as mining consultant, and had received several visitors during his stay, including a Mr. Cornelius Shaw. The connection was now complete. Major Ashworth had been orchestrating the entire operation from behind the scenes, using his wartime acquaintance with Sir Reginald to gain access to London's investment community, then leveraging his relationships with Shaw and Dr. Vance to identify and approach potential victims. But where was he now? The answer came from Inspector Japp's methodical investigation of property purchases in the 6 months since the mining fraud's collapse. Cross-referencing the names Edmund Ashworth, Vincent Morrison and their known associates, he discovered a significant transaction, the purchase of a substantial house in Hampstead by one Major E. Morrison. Hampstead, Poirot mused, the same area where Dr. Vance mentioned meeting the mysterious Major. He's been operating practically next door to his co-conspirators. The house on Hampstead Heath was imposing and well-maintained, with high walls and mature gardens that provided complete privacy from neighboring properties. As they approached the front entrance, Poirot noticed several details that confirmed they had found their quarry: military precision in the landscaping, security measures that were subtle but thorough, and the kind of careful anonymity that suggested someone with much to hide. Major Ashworth answered the door himself, a lean, authoritative man in his 40s, whose military bearing was unmistakable. His left hand was indeed concealed in a black leather glove, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Gentlemen," he said retry. "Yes, continue edit. Gentlemen," he said with complete composure, as if he had been expecting their visit. "I assume you're here about the unfortunate affair at Victoria Station. Please come in." The interior of the house was as precisely organized as its owner, sparse but elegant furnishings, everything in its exact place, with the kind of order that spoke of military discipline applied to civilian life. Major Ashworth led them to a study lined with maps of South Africa and mining engineering texts. "You may dispense with any pretense of ignorance, Major," Poirot said, settling into the offered chair. "We know about the mining fraud, about Vincent Morrison, and about your role in the deaths of Sir Reginald Thornfield and his widow." Ashworth poured himself a whiskey with steady hands, not bothering to offer drinks to his visitors. "I wondered how long it would take someone competent to piece it together. The local police were hopelessly out of their depth, but I recognized your reputation, Monsieur Poirot, when I read about your involvement in the case." "Then you admit your guilt?" "I admit to protecting myself and my interests when threatened by people who didn't understand the larger picture." Ashworth settled behind his desk, every inch the commanding officer addressing subordinates. Sir Reginald and his wife were casualties of their own naive idealism. Japp leaned forward aggressively. "You murdered 2 innocent people to cover up a swindle.
I eliminated 2 threats to an operation that was providing significant benefits to all involved parties. The investors received excellent returns on their money for over 6 months before Sir Reginald's interference disrupted everything. But the mine didn't exist, Poirot pointed out. The mine was irrelevant. What mattered was the cash flow, the confidence, the systematic transfer of wealth from those who had too much to those who could use it more effectively. Ashworth's eyes took on the fervor of a true believer. Do you have any idea how many fortunes in this country are built on exploitation and fraud? I simply made the process more efficient by murdering your business partner. Sir Reginald was never truly a partner. He was a useful front, nothing more. His reputation and social connections provided credibility to the operation, but when he developed an inconvenient conscience, Ashworth shrugged. Business decisions sometimes require unpleasant actions. Poirot studied the man across the desk with fascination and horror. Tell me, Major, how did you recruit Sir Reginald initially? We served together in South Africa during the war. He was involved in evaluating mining claims for the military legitimate work, but it gave him just enough knowledge to be useful for our purposes. When I approached him in 1922 with the opportunity, he was already struggling financially and eager for a solution to his problems. And you convinced him the mining venture was legitimate. I provided him with documentation that appeared legitimate. The geological surveys, the ore samples, the corporate structures, all professionally crafted to withstand casual scrutiny. Sir Reginald saw what he wanted to see, a chance to restore his family's fortune, but he discovered the truth. Ashworth's expression darkened slightly. Sir Reginald had an unfortunate tendency toward thoroughness. When he began conducting independent verification of our geological data, he stumbled upon inconsistencies that led him to question the entire operation. So you killed him. I arranged for his death. Yes, the motorcar accident was elegant in its simplicity. A small cut in the brake line, a predetermined route through dangerous terrain, and an inevitable conclusion that appeared entirely accidental. Japp was taking notes furiously, recording every detail of the confession, and Lady Margaret. Lady Margaret was a more complex problem. She possessed her husband's thoroughness but lacked his trusting nature. When she began her investigation, I initially hoped she would simply exhaust herself pursuing false leads, but when she contacted Shaw, and that investigator Morse, you realized she was getting close to the truth. She had identified the key participants and was beginning to understand the scope of the operation. More dangerously, she had begun to suspect that her husband's death was not accidental. I couldn't allow her to continue. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his green eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and disgust. The meeting at Victoria Station, that was your arrangement. I contacted her through an intermediary, claiming to be someone with information about her husband's death. I suggested we meet discreetly, using the old train schedule as a nostalgic reference to their courtship. Lady Margaret was romantic enough to appreciate the symbolism. But something went wrong with your plan. For the first time, Ashworth showed a flicker of annoyance. I had intended for her death to appear natural, a heart attack brought on by the emotional stress of learning the truth about her husband. The injection of air into her bloodstream should have been undetectable, but the presence of unexpected witnesses forced me to act more hastily than I preferred. The puncture wound behind her ear, a regrettable necessity. When I saw that railway porter approaching, I had to complete the injection quickly and withdraw the needle before I could properly conceal the entry point. Japp looked up from his notes. What about Shaw and Dr. Vance? Were you planning to eliminate them as well? Shaw was becoming unreliable, and Dr. Vance's conscience was proving inconvenient, but their deaths could wait until the immediate threat had been neutralized. Ashworth's tone was completely matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than multiple murders. And the money from the fraud, properly invested in legitimate enterprises. The funds have generated substantial returns that benefit numerous worthy causes. Unlike my former partners, I understand that wealth is a tool to be used strategically, not hoarded sentimentally. Poirot stood slowly, his face reflecting profound sadness. Major, do you feel any remorse for what you have done? Ashworth considered the question seriously. Remorse is a luxury for people who have the option of acting differently. I had a duty to protect the operation and ensure its success. Personal feelings are irrelevant when weighed against strategic necessity. Even when the cost is measured in human lives, every significant achievement requires sacrifice. The only question is whether the sacrifice serves a worthy purpose. As Inspector Japp placed the handcuffs on Major Ashworth's wrists, the man maintained his military bearing, accepting arrest with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout their conversation. There was something almost admirable about his complete lack of self-pity or excuse-making, even as his actions revealed him to be utterly without conscience. "Major Ashworth," Poirot said as they prepared to leave, "there is one final question. The silver hairpin you sent to Lady Margaret, why that particular gesture?" For the first time, Ashworth smiled, though it was not a pleasant expression. Lady Margaret was a woman who appreciated beautiful things, even in her reduced circumstances. I thought she deserved one final moment of pleasure before the end. As they escorted their prisoner from the Hampstead house, Poirot reflected on the strange mixture of efficiency and cruelty they had uncovered. Major Ashworth had committed his crimes with military precision, but had retained just enough humanity to provide his final victim with a small, meaningless kindness. "Well, Poirot," Japp said as their police car made its way through the London traffic, "another case closed. Though I have to say, this Ashworth fellow is one of the coldest customers I've ever encountered." "Indeed, mon ami," Poirot replied quietly, "but perhaps that is what made him so dangerous. A man who can plan murder with the same detachment he would use to plan a military campaign is capable of anything." In the end, Lady Margaret Thornfield had gotten her wish. Her husband's death had finally been avenged, and the truth about the mining fraud had been exposed. But the cost of that justice had been her own life, sacrificed to draw out a killer who had proven more ruthless than anyone could have imagined. The case of the last passenger on Platform 6 would go down in Poirot's files as one of his most disturbing victories, a reminder that sometimes the greatest evil comes not from passion or desperation, but from the cold calculation of those who have learned to see other human beings merely as obstacles to be removed. As their car disappeared into the London fog, the empty bench on Platform 6 stood silent, waiting for the next passenger, who would never board a train that would never come. Thank you for joining me for another tale from the files of Hercule Poirot. I'm Stephen, and this has been Cozy Mysteries. Until next time, remember that in the world of detection, the truth has a way of emerging from even the most carefully constructed lies, but sometimes the price of that truth is higher than anyone should have to pay.